Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Flipping the World podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the stories of energy leaders across our industry to find out more about their career and life journeys. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Zach Fenton. Zach co-founded UpCurve Energy and built it from the ground up into a company producing 15,000 barrels a day across 20,000 acres in the Delaware Basin here in the U.S. Prior to co-founding UpCurve, Zach worked as a reservoir engineer in ConocoPhillips, and before that, he spent several years at Conoco in various strategy roles, BD, and leadership support positions between Houston and Aberdeen. Prior to joining Conoco, Zach worked as an associate at the New York-based private equity firm Lindsay Goldberg and as an analyst in Morgan Stanley's investment banking division, where he focused primarily on energy industry, M&A, and financing. Zach received an MBA with honors from the Wharton School and a certificate in petroleum engineering from Texas A&M. He graduated cum laude from Duke University with a BA in economics, where he was a member of their Division I men's lacrosse team. What an introduction, Zach. This is just a tip of the iceberg and a very quick summary of just all of your accomplishments and just your incredible story that we can't wait to dive deep into and find out a little bit more about you. So thank you for being on the podcast and for sharing a little bit about with your journey with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting us a few weeks ago at your recent event. We really enjoyed it.
Zach, it was such a pleasure to finally meet you in person at the event and your team. And it really spoke volumes, just meeting everybody that you work with and all the great things they had to say about you and your leadership. So it means a lot for us to be having you on the podcast, but more importantly, to share your journey with all of our listeners. And I think it's really cool how you grew up. So you grew up outside of Philadelphia. Both of your parents were doctors. So right from the start, energy didn't really seem like that was going to be something you were going to fall into. So both of your parents being doctors, they were both gone at multiple times because that is a very demanding job. However, they always found time to be with you, and you had a really fun childhood and a very loving family. Can you tell us what it was like growing up in that environment and also having two very successful parents, what that kind of instilled in you in a young age, seeing them work hard and also the successes of really what they put into their daily job?
Yeah, of course. It was great. I was very fortunate growing up with such a close-knit family. Both of them were physicians, as you had said. They had their medical practices, and they were often always on call or patients calling them throughout the night. And so their jobs were not the kind of jobs where you can just turn out the lights at the office each day and head home and forget about it until you show up the next day. And so that was really instructive. And being an entrepreneur is a lot like that. You can't just turn it off and show up again the next day. It's something that kind of you live with, and you have to love enough because it's something that sticks with you. I learned a lot about hard work and discipline from both of them. They manage full schedules, prioritizing what's important. They made it to all of I had two brothers, and made it to all of our sporting events and our school stuff. I think what I learned from them was to really focus and prioritize on what matters to you. And for them, that was their career and their family. And they did a really good job of not letting a lot of other things get in the way of that. And so I was very fortunate growing up with them and kind of how they raised us.
I loved how you mentioned it, because I really think sometimes it depends on how you look at it as a child, where you could be like, my parents are home, I'm not as important. Other parents finish at 5 and they're home. And so it's really all perspectives. And a lot of the successful people that we've spoken with, it's all about just your mindset and how you are looking at this as an inspiration instead of something to be like they weren't home as much. You saw this as they can have a career, have a great, life together, and also like a great family with 3 children, et cetera. So thank you for sharing that, because I think it really matters how you visualize a lot of things. And just talking a little bit about your journey early on, you were sent to boarding school, and then you went to Duke University, and then you managed a career in investment banking, New York, and then eventually ended up in the energy sector, which is quite diverse, right? I don't think there was a path that you had, written down of how it was going to all work out. It seems to be very serendipitous at this point. How did all of these early experiences, at boarding school, et cetera, shape you into, the leader that you are today, and even the entrepreneur that you had to be to make UpCurve successful?
Yeah, going to boarding school was an amazing experience. I kind of learned how to learn and how to study there. We worked very hard. You did not have a sort of parental influence there to remind you every night. You really had to become independent and accountable yourself. And so you learn over those couple of years before you get to college, you need to be disciplined. You need to focus on your work. You need to get that done. And you didn't need someone there to tell you to do that. You have to learn that lesson along the way. And so by the time I got to college, I think I was more than adequately prepared academically for what that was like. And so, yeah, I went to Duke. I knew I wanted to be an investment banker, but I didn't know anything beyond that. I didn't know anything about energy. I didn't really even know anyone who worked in oil and gas growing up. So I started at Morgan Stanley, and just by dumb luck ended up in the energy group. It was a great group. And from that point on, I just really enjoyed and began to love the business and the energy business. I just enjoy how it's so fundamental to everything in our world. But working in investment banking and private equity, really, that was in my first years out of college, gave me just a very solid foundation and framework of which to view the world. And so it very much focused on value and value creation and what do shareholders care about and what matters, what doesn't. And that is kind of the paradigm or the way I view and have since viewed the world as a business person. And so I moved into reservoir engineering later in my career when I was at Conoco, and I wasn't just a technical reservoir engineer as a result. I was probably more of a commercial and a practical one, having spent that time in investment banking. And it really allowed me, which is incredibly helpful now as an entrepreneur, to understand and pull all the different parts of the business together. I understand kind of started with the bigger picture appreciation, and then it allows you all the different pieces, how they fit together. And so it was a really important part of getting me to where I am today, even if it wasn't necessarily part of an originally mapped out or career path.
Yeah, no, so tell me about that, because when I look back kind of even at your resume and like where you started and where you got to and working at Conoco, it seems quite opposite of what you usually see. So you usually have like a reservoir engineer that maybe was working for an operator, and then they get intrigued by investment banking, and then they have that background experience. Then they get into investment banking to help, find those right the right companies for that banking investment firm to accept. However, yours was a little bit opposite and like quite a transition, because you went from energy, banking, private equity to operating an upstream company, which is really the reverse when you think about it. Like at the time, what were you thinking, and like what transitioned you into that? And how do you think you got set up correctly in order to do that? Because I imagine people had thought about it all the time, but maybe they don't have the right connections or the right relationships. Was there something specifically that helped you make that decision?
Yeah, for sure. And it's I think fairly uncommon. I remember when I was going through my reservoir engineering program and working at Conoco, I don't know that anyone had done that before at the company in terms of going from finance into engineering. I think what I realized early on was I really love the energy business. I worked with a lot of great executives and entrepreneurs at the when I was in investment banking or private equity. But I realized also I was more interested in kind of being on their side of the table, and being in the hot seat and the one responsible and accountable for the decisions than just being the advisor or the investor. And I think part of it was my world to that point was the Northeast and investment banking. And that felt like the path of least resistance, the easier thing for me to do. And I wanted to do something different for whatever reason. I wanted to try something different and not just slot into that path that I at least initially started on. And so I went back to business school with the idea and hope to then work at an operating oil and gas company. And it was funny, as you said, most of my classmates in business school were trying to get into banking and private equity and interviewing for it, and I was going the other direction, and they couldn't quite figure out what I didn't get or what I missed, and anyway, so different career path. I think what I also, for whatever reason, I don't know where it came from, I didn't make, I hope I haven't ever made career decisions just based on what's the best way to maximize my income next year, or how do I get paid slightly more, because if that was my mindset, I probably would never have left banking or private equity. I was more interested in doing something different, learning a new skill set, building out, my skill set, and just doing something different. And in the long run, I knew or believed it would pay off and hope it will, even if it wasn't exactly clear, next year where I was going to be, or year 3, what was that going to look like?
So let's talk about when you started UpCurve, because it was a kind of like a downturn, or I believe it was a downturn in the oil market at that time. And that was a big move that you guys were, you decided to keep going. Even though things were probably challenging, I'm sure a lot of people were telling you or giving you advice, because people love giving advice. You shouldn't do this, stay in your corporate career, a steady paycheck. Why are you going to be an entrepreneur, especially in such a cyclical industry? So tell me a little bit about what was it like starting UpCurve, like those difficult times during that downturn, and what has been the biggest challenge that you had to face early on at the beginning of the company, and how did you navigate through all of that?
Yeah, well, it's a good point you make on advice. I got lots of advice. Some of it was supportive, and a lot of it was not. And it's not that it's bad advice. It's just I didn't always feel like it applied to me. I remember one of my mentors said, I've seen a lot of people go this route and raise private equity, and most of them have failed. I remember another person, seasoned, kind of experienced executive, told me, well, you're not really a reservoir engineer because you've only done that for a bit. It's like, I don't, you really need a core skill set that you've spent 10 to 15 years working to develop. And so I got lots of different advice. It wasn't all helpful, or I didn't think it all was, some of it I just chose not to believe. But we started UpCurve 2015 timeframe, and it was a downturn. We were initially really excited about that. We thought, okay, we're going to hopefully raise a bunch of money and be buyers, buy low, sell high. And we're like, this is great. Oil's maybe in the 20s, 30s. Our timing couldn't be better. And we were fortunate enough to, after we raised some capital, once we were bidding on opportunities, quickly realized that even though, it was a downturn, it's really hard to buy and invest in companies. If you're not just buying in public shares, it's really hard to buy assets in the downturn, especially good or decent assets, because the companies are people who have good assets a lot of time, don't actually have to do anything with them, and they prefer to not sell when you're at the bottom. And so, like I learned in business school, buying low is great. In practice, I learned right away that's very, very hard to do. And so we just needed time, honestly, as commodity oil prices recovered and they got back to a more reasonable range. Buyer and seller expectations converged a little bit, and it was just much more easier to transact. And so that was one of the learnings. I think we applied it in this past downturn during the COVID. We made some acquisitions, but even that, those were hard to come by, and we would have loved to have done a lot more, but it's just very difficult in a downturn to do that. I think one of the other experiences that was really challenging and we had to learn on the way was putting together the right team early on. It's different from working at ConocoPhillips or Morgan Stanley, where you have this massive safety net and job security. And I think everyone acts differently in a smaller, higher risk environment. Some people's skill sets better lend themselves to that. And I think it took us some time to find the right pieces and team for us to succeed in the long run. But that was absolutely a learning of some of the early days.
No, thanks for sharing that, Zach. And what's even more impressive about your story is during this time, you were also building your family. So on a personal level, you have 4 kids. So even when I saw that, I was like shocked, just because, being an entrepreneur, it's very time consuming, like we'd already mentioned before, but also, family life is like central to you and your wife. And so, you grew up in having your mom and your dad, even though they worked hard and were gone some of the time, like they did prioritize, being with you and your brothers. And so you obviously wanted kind of the same thing for your kids. How were you able to balance that demand, especially could you just mention too, some of the struggles of starting UpCurve, while you also are starting this family? And, what advice do you have for those that are in your position, or even those that are in like an entrepreneur type role, or just a father in general, on how are you able to balance it, and then also try to turn it off when you get home? Because like you said before, like there's no turning off work when it's your baby. But still, like, how were you able to make that adjustment?
Yeah, and, having kids has been an amazing part of what allows me to kind of cope with the highs and lows of being an entrepreneur. I mean, even if you can't necessarily kind of leave it at the office, every day when I walk in the door, they're always excited to see me, and and they expect me to, be a good parent at the same time. I can't take a day off from that. I can't show up grumpy because I had a, crummy day at the office, et cetera. And so um, that's allowed me to, as best I can, kind of switch into parenting mode. And they don't care. They don't care whether I had a good day or a bad day. They're happy to hang out, and that has been incredibly helpful from a sort of stress management perspective. Is that I can show up and for a few hours, I'm with family, and like I said, they're just happy to be with me, and that's refreshing. But it's hard. I think I learned from my parents. You have to be disciplined in what you're undertaking. I don't have a lot of time for hobbies. I think Alan from Rockcliffe at your conference put it great. He said when you're a parent of a young family, your golf handicap should not be going down. It should be going up, and so I agree with that. I 100% agree with that. My weekends are for spending it with the kids. Both my wife and I coach a lot, and or take them to all their games and school events. And so, but that's the choice we've made. We have work and we have family. And so I hope it's helpful in terms of my leadership style. I think it's because I value family so much. We try to be flexible at UpCurve as well to accommodate that, whether it's time off after a baby or managing schedules. If everyone has to drop their kids off in the morning and pick them up from school in the afternoon, I think we're open-minded to that and leading by example in that sense. It's easy to say one thing but when they see me picking up my kids or taking out, if I have to leave early and then I'll sign back on that night because I have to go to a sporting game, I think then it really makes it clear that is important value for the organization. So it's a big influence on my leadership style, but also just on kind of how I manage the day-to-day stresses.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that, because I think sometimes you really have to walk the talk, especially in a smaller company where they are looking up at leadership and they can see you, see your actions. And I always say, if I can see my manager say hey, I'm picking up my kids, or I need to go see my kids play, etc., it just gives me a little bit a comfort of, okay, if my manager finds that valuable, then I can do it. It's almost like a reassurance as an employee that it's okay. And I don't think sometimes leaders see how important just even those things are, because then it makes you just happier to come to work because your boss is doing it. So it gives you that freedom. So I really like that you mentioned that. On the topic of advice, what would you tell a young professional, which I feel like you are a young professional yourself, who aspires to follow a similar path like yourself, either in entrepreneurship or kind of switching career paths like you've done already 3 times? What is there a key principle or something that you followed? Did you follow your heart? Did you follow your brain? What do you think, looking back when you piece things backwards? Was there something that was consistent across your decisions to end where you are today?
Yeah, I think one thing and piece of advice we kind of talked about a little earlier is most career paths are not linear. And despite everyone's best intentions coming out of school or wherever, if you map it out and expect to adhere to that very disciplined, you're going to miss an opportunity. You're going to miss something that comes along that you didn't plan for, or you're going to realize there's a skill set or an interest that you have that you hadn't understood when you were 22 or 24. And so along those lines, one thing I tell anyone who's interested in listening is when you're young and even now, even older, is try to say yes more than you say no. Whether that's your boss asks you to help out on a random project or a volunteer assignment or a cocktail hour or a happy hour invite. You never, ever know where those things are going to lead to. And most of the time, you go and you have a nice time or you work hard on that random project. But a lot of times they turn into, whether it's the core of an idea for a new business or a connection you make. And so saying yes more than you say no, I think is incredibly helpful, especially when you're younger and maybe you have less of family obligations and the ability to do that. And so that's been something I think is really important. And then to be an entrepreneur, you do have to take some risk. It's not possible to line up, you know, everything perfectly to where you're not taking any risk. When we were fundraising early on, at some point we had to make the decision to leave ConocoPhillips and leave the steady jobs there, even before we had our capital committed, and that was a big leap because there was a lot of negotiating had to be left to do, but it was a non-starter for the investment groups if we hadn't left Conoco, because we needed to demonstrate that we were all in and willing to take the risk on this idea. And so, you know, if you find yourself and you're probably not taking the meaningful amount of risk, you're probably not pushing the envelope enough as it relates to being an entrepreneur. So those are some of the thoughts I have.
Yeah, I don't think you could have gone like any closer to the next question that I was going to ask you, which is around failure. Because when we talk about entrepreneurship and taking that leap, and in the beginning, we kind of asked you, you got a lot of feedback, and so not only do you get feedback when you're doing something like this, and also sometimes it's negative feedback, like kind of trying to push you away from taking on, the role or taking the position or starting a company, but then you also have to deal with possibly failing. And a lot of times, even if it is a success, there are failures that you go through in order to even get to that point. And we have heard from many that those are the biggest lessons and the biggest, the monumental moments in your life is when you fail. It's not when everything is going great. Can you tell us about a time that you maybe recall having a failure, and really what you learned from that and how you were able to come out of it even better than when you went into it?
Yeah, for sure. That's a critical part of any endeavor, I think. So I was an athlete in college, as you all mentioned, and on a team, you lose games, you have crappy practices, but what you learn early on, if you're going to be successful, is you have to show up again the next day. You can't take a play off, you can't take the practice off, because then it compounds and starts building this negative cycle. You can't show up the day after your coach chewed you out for having a bad practice, moping around, because that will continue to happen. You need to show up with a blank slate. You need to learn from what happened and why you had that failure. But you need to show up again the next day. And it's the same at the office. If we have an issue or a well has a problem, I can't show up all grumpy and whatnot the next day. Obviously, I'm disappointed as much, if not more so than everyone. But we need to figure it out, and we need to get back on straightening things out the next day. And you learn failure every day in this business. I mean, we were told no when we were raising money many, many more times than we were told yes. As we've tried to buy and bought assets over the years, you're told no 99% of the time. One guy, I remember one of the first bids we put on an asset, one guy asked if we had missed a zero in our number. And so it's not just taking the lessons from failure, but it's also learning how to deal with it. The mentality is like, you just got to go back out and take another shot. You can't let it get you down. And so I think learning how to deal with failure is as important as learning the lessons from that specific failure. So I've certainly experienced plenty of it.
We usually like asking high performers a little bit about their routine. So do you do anything particular daily, whether it's like working out, walks, a sleeping routine, a specific, I don't know, do you read certain books, self-help books? We need tips. Like, what are some stuff you can give us?
Yeah, I do all of that. I'm a morning person, so I get up early, 5-ish or so, and that's when I get my workouts is in the morning. And I find getting that out of the way just sets a really, really good tone for the day. It is massively helpful in terms of dealing with the stress. It doesn't solve your problems, but it puts you in the right mindset to tackle them. And so tons of mornings I have no interest in doing it, but if I'm able to do that most days of the week, that gets me into a good spot. I read before bed. I listen to a ton of self-help and business books in the car when I'm commuting, but at night I like to read fiction, just whether it's science fiction or history or whatever. It helps me sleep. I'm always super, super focused on optimizing my routine and tweaking and getting as much and high quality sleep as possible. So I have all sorts of goofy routines and that kind of thing, but pretty focused on that because I love what I do. I want to be a good parent for a long time. I want to keep being an entrepreneur for a long time. I have no plans to change, and I don't want to have to slow down for any reason.
I'm really glad that you mentioned working out because that's Marcel and I's favorite thing to do. So we always tell people you've got to like put it in your schedule. Do you like physically put it in your schedule so that you go and do it?
No, but I've done that for some things. I've done
Okay.
that when I, have some reflection time or whatever. I'm like, I just need to block out 30 minutes. I'm going to put it in my Outlook calendar.
Yeah.
My The morning workout's early enough that I'm not at huge risk of someone putting something else overlapping with it. But that's a good idea. I found that does work.
Yeah, you always got to block it. We're like, make it a priority. No, I'm so glad you shared that because you have a busy schedule and 4 kids, and so to share that that is a priority for you, I think is really important. To close, we did want to talk about something that you mentioned when we met, and that was, you talk to people and experts who have already done what you want to do. So most of the time, there's always somebody out there that has done it before. They have the knowledge, they have been there before, they have the experience. So it's not always like you're the only one, even though sometimes when you're starting a company or starting a new endeavor, you start to feel like, well, nobody else has done this. Like, who can I reach out to? But really, there is always somebody who has done it, and they can really give you that advice. um, and this is how you felt when you started the operating like the oil field company, UpCurve, but also, you reached out to those that because it's best to use your network. We always say that. What advice do you have for those that really are looking to do something different? Maybe they don't have a lot of knowledge about it, but it's something that you can always find like a resource. What can you provide, like, as far as, maybe steps they could take or ways that you were able to overcome those feelings of like not knowing, to feel confident enough to move forward in your new endeavors that you took on?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you need to rely on your network. It was funny when my one of my initial partners, JJ, and I were mapping out and just talking about the business early days at the coffee shop at Conoco. It was incredibly intimidating because, like, okay, how are we going to operate these wells? What are we going to do for safety policies? What about regulatory? And we're like, I don't know. Like, what in the world? How are we going to do all this stuff? And then you ask people. You're not the first. There's people who've come before you. I think we realized we were coming. What our strengths were reservoir engineering, valuation, understanding key value drivers, and hopefully being able to buy good opportunities at the right time. And that was our strength. Operating the well or building a tank battery was not our strength. But there's so much entrepreneurship in the oil field and outside, I'm sure. Um, there's a million different business models. There's someone out there who just builds tank batteries, and there's someone out there who just contracts operators for wells or helps companies with their regulatory policies and implementation. And you just need to talk to people. You need to ask. It kind of goes back to saying yes more than you say no. You get invited to an industry happy hour, just go. You never know who you're going to meet because there's guaranteed someone who has solved all your exact same problems before you, and you do not need to recreate the wheel. Where you need to spend your time is on what your core competencies and your strengths are, and you can find people to plug the holes where you don't have as much competencies out of the gate, I would say.
I love that you shared it in that way, Zach. And I think what's so important about your whole journey is there's things along the way that you didn't know, like it wasn't given to you. You weren't an expert in them, but yet you still took it on and you found out ways around it. And there's a lot of times too, where you mentioned like your network and your relationships and reaching out to other people. And I think the biggest thing that I can take away from your story is really like, no matter where you start from, as long as you are willing to go that extra mile and like that and communicate what you want, but more importantly, go to those that you know and use your network. There's no point in knowing all these people if we're not going to go and reach out to them, ask them questions. Even like you mentioned, when you worked at Conoco, they have an HSE department. They have all these departments that you probably, could have asked one of them down for coffee and
Exactly.
like learn how they did it, right? Like, and all these things, I think sometimes we get so scared and we don't think about it. We're like, oh, you're right, I do know that person. Well, if you know them, I mean, what's the point of knowing someone if you don't
Yeah.
if you don't ask them, right?
Yep.
So I love that about your journey, and more importantly, it's so great hearing that you're a father with 4 kids and finding the time to be there for them and really acknowledging the fact that, yeah, my golf game's not going to be great because I am going to prioritize my family. It's so refreshing to hear, because so many times, we have moms on the podcast and they always feel like they have to give up so much. And it's so nice to hear now fathers are like, hey, I'm taking a seat back and I'm not going to go spend 6 hours at the golf, going to play golf, because I know that's 6 hours that my wife is like, hounding around 4 kids. So, and especially somebody like you that's in the role that you're in today, to just be able to come out and say that is really important. And I'm really glad you shared that today on the podcast, as well as your incredible journey. And we're so excited to see where UpCurve goes. And with your leadership and the team that you have, we know it's going to be like extremely successful. So we're just very happy that we caught you at this moment, and we're able to share your story.
No, it's amazing. Thank you so much for having me both. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Zach. And if you like this podcast, please support, like, subscribe, follow us, leave a review. We love hearing from you. And you can always find us on LinkedIn at Flipping the Barrel, or Instagram, Flipping the Barrel. And of course, our email, if you want to reach out, is flippingthebarrel@gmail.com. So everything's pretty in sync, really easy to find us. So stay tuned for the next episode.